Hey everybody, this is your Mind Translated podcast. This is your host, Jack, so let's get to it. Hey everybody, crazy times these days. The world seems to be going in the same direction, in no direction, and we don't know what the fuck is going on. We've got a new president-elect for the United States again. It has been such a controversy for the past few months concerning the elections. Politics is something that I willingly choose usually not to discuss with anybody because it's such a complex topic, and also because I have no idea of what I'm saying when it comes to politics or religion for that matter, so I try to stay away from it. But it seems that everybody has something to say these days concerning politics or President Trump. Wars seem to continue in the Middle East and elsewhere. Today I was thinking about delving into two fascinating phenomena that seem to define our species. One is our tendency to repeat the same mistakes again and again, and the other is our deep-seated habit of somehow always romanticizing the past. Now, if we take a moment to think, how many times have we looked at history and thought, well, surely we've learned from this, but yet somehow here we are, war after war, crisis after crisis, repeating cycles of behavior that seem maddeningly predictable. And this begs the question, why? Let's start with our uncanny ability to make the same mistakes over and over. Psychologists might call this phenomenon recurrent compulsion, a subconscious drive to reenact past experiences, often rooted in our unresolved emotions. On an individual level, it's why someone might continually choose toxic relationships or self-sabotage opportunities. And on a societal level, it manifests as a cyclical pattern of wars, economic bubbles, and social unrest. But why don't we learn? You might expect that after all these years, after all these decades of the same issues, which seem to be very similar. They come up again and again with different faces, but the reasons are usually the same. Part of the answer lies in our cognitive wiring. We are creatures of habit. Our brains are designed to seek patterns and shortcuts, heuristics, if you will. These mental shortcuts save time and energy, but often lead us into traps of overgeneralization and bias. Add to that confirmation bias, our tendency to seek information that supports what we already believe, and it's easy to see how we perpetuate mistakes. I mean, take war, for instance. Time and time again, societies rationalize conflicts as being different from the last. This one is justified, we tell ourselves. Yet, the underlying motives, power, resources, ideological dominance are eerily similar. Historian Barbara Tuchman called this the March of Folly in her analysis of catastrophic decisions throughout history. But okay, let's be fair to ourselves for a moment. The past may repeat, but it doesn't repeat exactly. Every cycle brings new variables, and perhaps this is why we fail to recognize the echoes until it's too late. When we talk about our repetitive behaviors, it's fascinating and a little unsettling to realize just how predictable we can be as a species. These cycles play out on both small and grand scales, from personal habits to major historical events, almost as if there is a blueprint we can't help but follow. Take a simple example. Think of how many of us are drawn to routines, even if those routines don't always serve us well. There is a psychological term for this too, status quo bias. Essentially, we tend to prefer things to stay the same, even when change might bring improvement. Whether it's staying in a unfulfilling job or sticking with a habit we know it's unhealthy, we often resist disrupting the patterns we've established. And of course, this behavior becomes more complex when we look at collective patterns across societies. History is filled with repeating motives, economic cycles, social movements, wars, blah, blah, blah. Consider the rise and fall of empires. Historians from the ancient Greeks to modern scholars have noted that civilizations follow a rough pattern of expansion, prosperity, and stagnation, and eventually decline. It's almost as if societies have life cycles, an observation that's been reinforced by thinkers like Ibn Khaldun, who suggested that every civilization is bound to decay as it becomes more indulgent and disconnected from its founding ideals. But why are we so predictable? In part, it's due to something psychologists call social contagion. People around us act in certain ways. Their behaviors influence us, often subconsciously. Think of how fads spread or how fear and greed can lead to bubbles in the stock market. We're fucking wired to mirror the actions and emotions of others, especially those within our own social group, which can amplify certain patterns until they become hard to break. There is also a darker side to our predictability that shows up in times of crisis. During periods of economic instability or social tension, societies often look for scapegoats, marginalizing certain groups to regain a sense of control. This scapegoating has been seen across centuries and cultures and countries, from medieval witch hunts to the persecution of ethnic minorities during economic downturns. This pattern speaks to a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. When we feel threatened, our natural instinct is to look for another to blame. In a similar way, even our political conflicts often mirror those of the past. Wars are frequently fought under the banner of ideals, democracy, justice, freedom. But if we strip away the rhetoric, the underlying motivations are strikingly similar across the time. Control over resources, territory, or influence. Nations repeat this cycle not because they haven't learned the costs of war, but because the potential gains in the short term are often viewed as outweighing those costs. Psychologically, these repetitive behaviors might also be a byproduct of what's known as cognitive inertia. This is our brain's tendency to cling to familiar ways of thinking, even in the face of new information. Cognitive inertia makes it difficult for us to adapt to change, especially when that change is complex or ambiguous. It's easier to fall back on old patterns than to confront the discomfort of uncertainty. Another factor at play here is collective memory, which is not merely a record of past events, but a shared understanding of who we are as a group. This collective memory can be powerful in uniting people, but can also limit us. We tell stories about our past that reinforce our identities, and sometimes these stories prevent us from moving forward. We may think of ourselves as a nation of peacekeepers or as a society built on certain ideals, and while these narratives gives us a sense of purpose, they also blind us to the ways in which we might be repeating history's mistakes under a different guise. But perhaps the most profound reason we repeat mistakes is the illusion that each generation believes its context is unique. We think we are different, that our technology, our social awareness, or our evolved values will somehow exempt us from the past's pitfalls. It's almost a kind of collective ego, this belief that we've progressed beyond the flaws of those who came before. And yet, time and again, we find ourselves repeating those same mistakes. All of this raises an important question. If we're so predictable, if our patterns are so entrenched, is there any hope for breaking them? Some might argue that our cycles are inevitable, that our nature as humans makes us bound to repeat the past. But others believe that by understanding these patterns deeply, by recognizing our biases, by questioning the stories we tell ourselves, by fostering empathy and openness, we can maybe disrupt this cycle. What's clear is that breaking free requires conscious effort. It requires us to do something inherently difficult for the human mind, to challenge what is comfortable, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to let go of the past without forgetting its lessons. In the end, Perhaps the real question isn't whether we can stop repeating history, but whether we can change our relationship with it. Seeing patterns as reminders to pause, reflect, and choose differently. Seeing patterns as reminders to pause, reflect, and choose differently rather than as inevitabilities, because while history may echo, it doesn't mean we have to dance to the same tune. And then there is another layer, which is our own relationship with time itself. Isn't it curious how we often idealize what came before? Childhood, simpler times, or even entire decades, each imbued with a golden glow of nostalgia. But nostalgia is a trickster. It's a psychological phenomenon rooted in our brain's tendency to filter memories through an emotional lens. Negative details fade while positive ones shine brighter. A process called rosy retrospection. This bias makes the past feel safer, more meaningful, and even magical. It's no wonder why many of us long for childhood. As children, we viewed the world with wonder, not burdened by the complexities of adult life. Even if childhood wasn't perfect, our brains smooth the edges, editing our memories like a film director curating the best scenes. And it's not just personal memories. Societies do it too. Think about how certain periods like the 1950s in America or the Renaissance in Europe are often romanticized. We gloss over the darker realities of those times. Systemic inequalities, wars, diseases. The past becomes a canvas for our collective imagination, where we paint over flaws with hues of longing and idealism. Now, what's fascinating is how these two tendencies, repeating mistakes and romanticizing the past, intertwine. Could it be that our nostalgia for the good old days blind us to the lessons history offers? Consider this. A nation romanticizes its imperial past, yearning for a return to its perceived former glory. That nostalgia drives policies that spark conflict, perpetuating cycles of conquest and resistance. On an individual level, someone might cling to an idealized version of a past relationship, repeating patterns in the hope of recreating that fleeting sense of happiness. In both cases, our longing for the past keeps us tethered to it, unable to fully step forward. So, how do we break free from this loop? How do we embrace the lessons of history without being trapped by its allure? Psychology suggests that awareness is the first step. Recognizing our biases, whether it's our tendency to romanticize or our failure to learn, that helps us make conscious choices. Practices like mindfulness can ground us in the present moment, allowing us to evaluate the past with clarity rather than sentimentality. And I know I've said this before, but I think it does help just taking a moment to reflect and just wonder what's going on in my head right now. That can bring a lot of insight into what our little planet is doing. And by little planet, I mean our mind. I think also that education plays a role too. We need to teach history not as a list of dates and events, but as a complex web of cause and effect, a mirror reflecting both our potential and our pitfalls. And perhaps most importantly, we need to cultivate empathy. Much of our repetitive behavior stems from an inability to see beyond our own perspective. Empathy challenges us to break out of our cognitive loops and imagine new paths forward. At the end of the day, we are beautifully, frustratingly human. Our mistakes remind us of our limitations, but our nostalgia reveals our capacity for hope. And maybe that's the balance we're meant to strike, acknowledging our flaws while holding on to the beauty of what once was. Thank you all for letting me be in your ears for this short period of time. You can see the links to my Patreon and the website Buy Me a Coffee down below, where you can donate and support the podcast, which is, as you know, greatly appreciated. Tune in for the next one. Much love, everybody. Khodafis.